I want to open my little notepad here as well, because I'm definitely taking notes. So the first, I would say I have three categories of questions. That's maybe the best way of putting it. And here we are. Now my own window popped back up, and I don't want to see it. How can I hide self view? It's still there. Doesn't matter. I'll ignore it. So the three types of questions is first sort of, I know you have a deep, intimate knowledge when it comes to emotion and practice. Can you give me the uh, bird's eye view, the easiest little metaphors that I can use to get a glimpse of everything that Flynn knows about emotion and how it relates to movement? So
Mhm.
that's sort of layer one.
Yeah,
Basic building blocks, simplest ways. Sort of what is the landscape? What does the land look like in the north, in the east, in the south, and in the
yeah,
west?
yeah.
Just to sort of have an idea. Then the second piece is practical tools before I'm practicing. So I'm on the verge of deciding to practice or not.
Hmm.
What can I do? What's an approach to not even say I now have to force myself to train, but rather to say what are all the things I can do before I feel like I'm in the mindset of practicing?
Hmm.
And then the other part is while practice, I'm not having a good time. What can
Hmm.
affect um, my motivation or my sort of how can I make the practice be more enjoyable?
Great.
Those would be the three big chunks I'm interested in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I definitely want to derail, but these are really great questions, so you might be able to keep me on track.
We'll see.
Um,
We'll see where it flows.
so the overview, what are the poles? What is the basic sort of orientation in the context of emotion? My answer for that would be surprise, would be
Hmm.
positive and negative surprise, would be the simplest way of explaining positive and negative emotion. If you're faced with many negative surprises, there's something that you want and you're not getting it as easily as you expect, that would be a negative surprise.
Hmm.
If there's something that you want and you're flowing towards it, that would be a positive surprise. You want a cookie and you get the cookie, great, you're happy.
Mm.
This is, of course, a very simplistic way of looking at it because the real world doesn't always give us the conditions that we're looking for. So if our happiness is only conditional on the receiving of the cookie, then we're actually creating something very fragile in terms of our kind of emotional well-being. So if I'm only happy when I get what I want,
Hmm.
I'm actually setting myself up to be not very happy.
Mm.
Um, so likewise, if I have very rigid expectations, it's very likely, and very rigid goals, it's very likely that I'm not going to, get exactly what I want, and that's also going to send me into a
Can you
more
already help me
negative
put this
emotional state.
into an acrobatic practice context? Just because I know you're so well versed in your own practice, you're exploring acrobatics too, of course, really adaptive parkour. But if you put this now into sort of the a movement context, how can I understand it in even simpler terms?
Yeah, and even simpler terms in a movement context. Um, Not to take it too seriously would be
Hmm.
a really important thing.
Hmm.
Because the moment that I crystallize around a goal, I'm actually setting myself up for this sort of more conditional happiness, unhappiness situation. So
Hmm.
again, play is very profound in this way, because play invites us into an approach behavior like, oh, I want to do this, but I don't want to do it because I have it as this rigid goal. It's like, it's more, can I do this sort of thing. So actually the whole context of play for many reasons, for generating variety, but also for this sort of looser expectation that we get from play. It's a very, conducive state to learn in. So
Mm.
yeah, I think a more
Is another way of
direct.
speaking about
Mhm.
play to say it is following one's interest. Like that's the task. That's
Yeah, I think
the
you
problem
could you
situation.
could put it in that way. Yeah, for sure. And then if you think about if you're trying to learn something and you have this very specific goal in mind, like you're trying to juggle four balls and it's like it's really frustrating when you don't get it. When you're
Mhm.
playing, you don't really run into that same kind of experience. You get frustrated, but
So,
I wouldn't say in quite the same sort of everything starts to break down. And this is the to be clear, negative
mm,
emotions aren't bad. They're just a signifier that you're not getting what you're expecting.
mhm,
And that can be a great learning signal. But the bad part of negative emotion tends to come with downward spirals, which is when we get
mhm,
into this sort of
mhm,
slope of self-consciousness and self-judgment. We start to think
mhm,
like, oh, that was really bad. I should be able to do this by now. Our movement
mhm.
becomes more tense. We start sort of co-contracting. We feel essentially under threat. And then
Mhm.
motor control starts to break down and we get much worse. So that's the bad part of feeling bad, really.
Can you describe to me the process by which motor control starts to break down? Like,
Yeah.
what's the best explanation for this?
Um, if you are in a more joyful state, you're going to have more. If you simply picture someone in a sort of joyful state, they're very sort of
Mm,
upright. Their body is very
mm,
open. They're very
mm,
relaxed. They're very spontaneous. You could say that they have more degrees of freedom,
mhm,
and that's really what joy is doing. It's increasing our degrees of freedom, and there are little studies on this. We can look at it
mhm,
as a concept, but there are little studies on this. Like they have people sort of walking in different emotional states, and they see more sort of open posture in the more positive emotional state. When we're in this sort of neutral or more joyful state, we have more degrees of freedom. We're more psychologically flexible. And
mm,
I would expect we're also slightly more physically flexible. In a negative emotional state, let's say we're anxious. If you picture an anxious person, they're essentially
mm,
closed.
mm,
Their body is reducing their movement options. They're reducing degrees of freedom. They're sort of closing
mm,
in, and that's a strategy. Sometimes that's the right strategy.
mm,
If you're rolling down a hill, for example, you probably want to be sort of closed down here. It's like a sort of bracing strategy.
mm.
So when we're in
If
a negative emotional
mhm.
state, we're just sort of yeah, we're closing down. Go ahead.
If negative states of mind decrease degrees of freedom, is that the same as saying the beginner learner benefits of negative degrees of freedom because they need to freeze them anyways because they're
Fair
too
question.
overwhelmed by the amount of possibilities?
So
I
it
would be
doesn't
curious.
freeze them appropriate to the context.
Hmm.
So it's going to freeze degrees of freedom relative to a more evolutionary context. So
Mm,
that's why all anxious people adopt a similar posture,
mm,
roughly. There is a if you Google anxiety, Google images anxiety, you see
mm,
people sitting in this sort of very specific
mm,
posture, which is related probably to some um, very early life sort of recovery pattern,
mm,
stress recovery pattern, this sort of closing in of the limbs.
mm,
So yeah, I would say that it reduces degrees of freedom, but not in an adaptive way, not in a way that's sensitive to the
mm.
actual environment, but rather to this sort of evolutionary context, and that's not really desirable for learning.
Does a state of play always exclude a very strict goal? Because you were mentioning the four ball juggling where it's easy to get frustrated and drop out of that playfulness. Like, are they exclusive to each other
Yeah, it's
or?
a great question. Intuitively, I would say not. I think you could have a goal and approach it in a playful way for sure. Yeah,
Mhm.
and to me, that would just
Then,
mean having
mhm,
being more open to different outcomes than having
mhm,
one very, very specific outcome that you're narrowly focused on. For me, that play is something that's very sort of broad perceptually.
mhm. So, play and narrow goals are hard to marry. But if I have something like a goal, I want to get better at the macaco. The typical
Mhm.
thing is um, if my goal statement is set too narrowly, I'm only getting a better macaco if I have a taller peak angle.
Mhm.
Then I have lots of ways of frustrating myself because chances of literally hitting the hardest part of the move and consistently getting better at that is difficult. But I can refine my goal setting, saying I want to get better at the macaco in general, and there are part problems like, pushing more through sort of a whole body extension without taking that as a cue to follow, but to say it's probably helpful if I use the maximum range of motion
Mhm.
and I see I'm not producing the maximum range of motion. So then I can start playing with challenges of saying, can I touch my waistband to the pool noodle that I've set up above me? And our chances that this immediately improves my peak angle are actually not so high because I've got another task to set myself for. But by deconstructing my goal, or not deconstructing actually, I would say by accepting that the goal consists of more sub problems and
Mhm.
allowing myself to make progress in any one of these,
Yeah.
then even though I have a goal, I can approach it in a playful way by sort of not being too set on how I achieve it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a kind of an eternal regress potentially there because it's like if I'm more
Mm,
open to unexpected sub goals. So it's like I
mm,
have this broad goal if I want to get more height, but then the exact
mm,
way that I'm going to do that is maybe more variable. But then how strict am I going to be about the exact way that I might get there? But I
mm,
would say broadly that yeah, play is more related to just being a bit less specific, a bit less
mhm,
yeah, a
mhm,
bit less narrow in exactly the way that things are going to go and being more open. A nice
mhm.
ecological dynamics way of defining play is the exploration of affordances.
Interesting. Interesting. Why is that a definition of play?
I think it's a good explanation of play. I think you
Hmm.
can see many different examples of play, and that explanation
Hmm.
doesn't vary much.
Hmm.
Um, it does a little bit because, for example, my son, you can give him a football and he'll kick it and kick it and kick it and kick it. And he's not exactly exploring. He sort of is. It's I'm not exactly sure
Hmm.
because it looks very repetitive, but there's a lot of variation within kicking the
Hmm.
ball. Sometimes he kicks it and it goes really far. Sometimes he kicks it and it goes out. Sometimes he kicks it and it doesn't
Hmm.
go anywhere. So there's a lot of
Hmm.
variation. So I think you can maybe refine the definition of play to include something about kind of the exploration of variation within affordances. But
Hmm. Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
so and you see children repeat things many, many times, and they're also
Hmm.
um, experiencing a lot of sort of sensory variation as well. Like kids are
Hmm.
very good at being surprised by things because their expectations are
Hmm.
very, very low, so they can repeat and repeat and repeat.
Ah,
And
that's
this is another
beautifully
part of
put.
this process
Uh,
is actually sensitivity because
mhm,
if we get positive emotion from being positively surprised,
mhm,
we can get more positively surprised by becoming more sensitive to smaller surprises.
mhm,
And so that might be becoming sensitive to, for example, that sensation of kind of elevation within a macaque.
mhm,
And you just notice that you felt a little bit more elevation, or not even more,
mm,
just some. And
mm,
this is something that I wanted to address as well, is that
mm,
the potential problem with this sort of measurement approach is that
mm.
it can actually take us away from the primary layer of experience.
Which is,
So you're asking what is the measurement approach?
I know the primary layer of experience.
It would be sensation. So our sense of how to explain our
Yeah,
our
that's getting
sense of
interesting.
self is made
Hmm.
up of many different streams of unimodal like sensations. So for
Hmm.
example, as I'm walking down the street, there are 10 different types of sensation, let's say, coming in. There's
Hmm.
like tactile sensation from my feet,
Hmm.
there's olfactory sensation, there's proprioceptive information, there's vestibular input, there's all sorts of different things. Um,
So, yeah,
and mhm.
what I can sense is that as long as I exclusively deal in the currency of external measures, I'm now tying my expectations to the changes in the outside world. And that's not always the best approach if I'm saying I want to practice for joy, because part of the sort of joy component, or not practice for joy, but I want to be aware that if I can shape my experience and lean it into a more positive direction, then that's probably a trade-off that I would want to make. But if I exclusively speak about external measures and I don't approach um, how to put this? If I don't have the language for saying, I think, can we talk about this a little bit more?
Yeah. So here's a key:
Hmm.
frequency. The
Hmm.
frequency of surprise is something that really relates to the joy,
Hmm.
to positive emotion. So if I only make my ability to be surprised
Hmm.
related to measurement, how I'm measuring my progress. So I made the macaco over a taller block, or I did,
Hmm.
larger degree of motion. The
Hmm.
frequency of surprise is always going to go down. Frequency being how many times something occurs within a fixed period of time. So if I'm only getting positively surprised by
Hmm.
this motion over the block, let's say over the stack of toilet
Hmm.
paper in your book,
Hmm.
then maybe I'm going to get surprised sort of 2 or 3 times within a session.
Hmm.
Whereas if I, through what I would see as practices, it's something that I think we have to practice,
Hmm. Hmm.
learn to reduce my, let's say, expectations in a sort of
Hmm.
deeper way. My rate of my frequency of surprise can go up by like 1,000%.
What would be the process by which frequency of the price will go up? What do I have to do?
Okay, so yeah, this is for me the two biggest things there. One would be relaxing, and this would answer your question of what I would do during a session if I'm finding it difficult.
Hmm.
It's also what I might do before a session if I'm coming into a practice session with all my
Hmm.
worldly, work
Hmm.
energy. I've just come from traveling on the underground train, and I'm, feeling very
Hmm.
stressed. Spending 5 minutes actually just laying on the floor, or even 2 minutes just laying on the floor,
Hmm.
working with a more sensory focus, just actually trying to totally sort of switch off the verbal thought and switch to a more sensory mode. So you're not trying not to think, but you're paying more attention
Which
to the
is
sensations of the body.
very difficult for the average person like me.
Yeah, and that's the trick, is like it is a practice, and it's, for me it would be more of a switching than a switching off.
Hmm.
So this would be one major thing, is reducing baseline muscle tone.
Hmm.
So just relaxing more, finding what may, whether that's through shaking, whether that's through just sort of taking a 5 minute, power nap and really feeling the weight of the body on the floor, but really relaxing. Um, in anxiety, muscle tone is generally higher. In
Hmm.
anxiety, effort used is generally higher. So people that are anxious are using more effort to
Hmm.
move than they need to, which is going to
Hmm.
make
Hmm.
everything harder.
Interesting. Yeah.
People in anxiety tend towards co-contraction, where both sides of a joint will be
Mm.
active, which makes movement stiffer and blockier.
Mm.
And then that's going to have all sorts of associations with overthinking, because you're sort of
Hmm.
under-reactive, under-responsive, under-reflexive.
Hmm.
So just quickly, yeah, so relaxation in that kind of direct muscular
How
sense.
can I,
Mhm.
how could I speak about this without no noceboing the shit out of everyone watching, and they're suddenly becoming extremely aware of any possibly negative thing?
Um, why would it be a nocebo?
Because now they start, similar to how I can start paying attention to my sleep quality, and as a result of it, it will go down.
Mhm.
If I start paying attention to how I'm co-contracting, I might have an expectation of how now the session's not going so well, or I'm not in a good state of practice.
Okay.
And learning to relax could be tough, but if I have my focus on some outside metric, my idea would be that even though I start however cramped up, if my principle is that I follow the path of least resistance and design tasks that are engaging and that are interesting, then I will, as a result, loosen up. But I don't have to sort of consider the negative of it.
I'm not totally following.
Um,
Maybe there's
if
some
I'm
priors that we're not sharing, or something like that.
or I'm not expressing clearly enough. Um, I'm wondering the okay. I have a fear that um, with something as well reasoned as and well researched as anxiety causes co-contraction will lead to more effort in motion, therefore is a bad thing. Now I can justify pretty much whatever I want by saying I want to avoid the bad thing. And it can drop into this rather than opening up possibilities, saying here's option A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's saying we definitely want to move away from state Z. And then it has this it gives me a directionality that I would say decreases my agency or decreases my freedom. That's a fear that I have. I'm not saying that
Mhm.
that's reality.
So, as I mentioned earlier, when we're decreasing degrees of freedom through negative emotion, is that a glass of milk?
It's actually what's it called? Yerba mate with milk.
Delightful. Brilliant. I think there can be a fear of saying, of connecting specific states to specific experiences from
Mhm,
our perspective as, from our sort of maybe biases as more, I don't know,
mhm,
like liberal philosophy. I'm assuming somewhat, but
mm,
there are some I would see sort of political biases that we've grown up with, or sort of
mhm,
philosophical biases that we've grown up with, which say that, for example, humans are basically a blank slate,
mhm,
and therefore everything we do is fundamentally a choice, and we
mhm,
have kind of total freedom. And I think anything that sort of contradicts that feels very uncomfortable.
mhm,
It feels like it's contradicting autonomy, which is a very high value in the sort of more like liberal philosophy. It's like we
mhm,
need to be able to make our choices. This is like the highest
mhm,
value.
mhm,
And when we make the observation that there are things physiologically, biologically that are
mhm,
constraints, this is something
mhm,
sort of almost taboo
mhm,
in
mhm,
a more sort of like left-wing movement philosophy, is to say that
mhm.
there are physiological, biological constraints. And one of those constraints in this context would be
Mhm.
anxiety.
Actually, I would. Oh, that's interesting. Um, Karl Popper, I can't quote him properly, but he said something along the lines of the root of all tyranny is the doctrine that the truth is manifest. Karl Popper being, probably, um, to me, it's one of the most central perspectives. Like neither being very left wing, very pro, sort of individual, um, pro reality is what we decide reality is, and neither being really sort of conservative, saying that things are best run. I don't even know how to put it, but it's sort of I'm trying to find out where I think the underlying principle that I want to follow is, or it's sort of a moral claim that I believe is that one of the highest means or the highest moral missions is to preserve the means of error corrections. And whenever I introduce a mean that can be um, that's very easy to find a sort of a place at center stage and not let go, then that mean can easily justify sort of all sorts of actions that follow from after. Like if there is power in bloodlines, now the people in power can decide essentially make up who should rule and who shouldn't, because if they're descendants from the right family, then of course we find something that's closer to the truth, which is great. If we look at bloodlines or whatever the claim is there, there's nothing where we can say inherent to people is that I don't know. Actually, I'm not even so sure on how well I'm jumbled.
I'm,
I'm
I'm
all over
following
the
what you're
place.
saying. I think
You
you're just
are?
saying that
Then
when
please
when
help
you
me.
make, yeah, yeah, when you make when you make claims on reality, and you're not able to be flexible on those claims, you risk losing the means of error correction.
Hmm.
Um, and then you don't get better explanations, and then you limit,
Hmm.
progress.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and then we can speak more in terms of, confidence rather than fact.
Hmm.
So and we can talk about
Hmm.
probability rather than certainty. And so for me to put it in
Hmm.
that language, I would say that I, I'm I'm confident that most of the time, if I go to practice and I
Mm.
don't first empty my cup, I'm not going to be able
Hmm.
to fill it with anything very interesting.
That's a very interesting statement. You're confident that if you don't empty your cup before practice, you're confident that you won't have a good practice of being able to fill it with something different.
And the nuance there is that sometimes my cup just happens to be a bit emptier.
Hmm. But now, like, isn't that a meme that in itself says, I shall empty my cup before I practice?
Where I see what we're talking about now connecting to my kind of
Hmm.
broader critique of
Hmm.
the kind of measurement approach,
Hmm.
shifting away from the primary layer at which movement
Mm.
occurs, is that
Mm.
the primary layer through which movement occurs is a fundamental and constant flow of sensory experience.
Mhm.
My broad view of movement is that it's a primary process experience, meaning
Mhm.
that movement is fundamentally a sensory experience. And we can experience this directly when we become self-conscious and our movement gets much, much worse. So when we start analyzing our movement, the quality
Mhm.
inevitably goes down. Our spontaneity inevitably goes down. Movement
In
is
the moment, right?
in
That's
the
true if
moment.
I'm, yeah. But if I'm looking at a sprinter who's trying to get faster at what they're
Yeah.
doing, then analyzing might be one of the most helpful things they'll ever do in their career.
It might be, but it might also be the case that the best sprinters in the world are not very analytic and that they have a coach who does that work for them.
If there's something, a truth that the coach is speaking about in terms of the movement quality
Yeah.
that can be improved, and they might not be analytic about it, they still have to understand it. If the insight is true, it might, of course, be that we have a crappy Olympic weightlifting coach who gives stupid cues, but the person is actually figuring out under the bar how to
Yeah.
solve the problem. And at the end, the coach nods off, but
It
they didn't
it
really help.
it, it might be better to draw a circle around the direct experience of movement for
Hmm.
now rather than the
Hmm.
this other thing because that's a harder
Hmm.
maybe less relevant. So
Hmm.
if the actual experience of movement in the moment
Hmm.
suffers when we apply an
Hmm.
analytic mind,
Hmm.
that tells us something about the way that movement is naturally regulated,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
it's through sensation. That doesn't mean that we're blah 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 internal focus. It doesn't mean that
Hmm.
we're,
Hmm.
directing our intention towards the sensations. But at an unconscious level, the inputs that are orchestrating the movements
Hmm.
are sensations.
Can
And
you help me understand
mhm.
why this isn't part of the naturalistic fallacy or the sort of fallacy of primacy of argument or source of argument? Why should it be the case that because direct experience of movement could be regarded as one of the most fundamental levers or layers in which I can think about movement, why isn't that like as reductionistic as saying really because atoms follow strictly speaking the rules of physics. If we could know how all the atoms in the universe moved and behaved, we could now predict how economy would turn out in 5 years from now.
Can you
Where
define the naturalistic fallacy for me?
that is essentially saying anything that is natural or that is evolved is um, is closer to the truth or more important in an explanation than anything that comes later on.
Would you say
So
that's a false inference or a false deduction?
I don't understand the
Yeah.
difference between those two.
So I would see that as a sort of false deduction that you're drawing like a broad principle that's not necessarily true.
Hmm.
So if I say everything that's natural is
Mhm.
good, I'm
Mhm.
creating a broad principle that I would then use to see, oh, well, hemp is natural, therefore it's good, for example.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
and that would be a deduction
Mhm.
from that broad principle of like the naturalistic fallacy.
Mhm.
Um, in this case, what I'm describing is
Mhm.
I'm not moving from that principle.
Mhm.
Um, I'm moving from the my deduction. So the
Mhm.
facts that I'm working from would
Mhm.
be, for example, an internal focus makes our movement generally worse in a complex environment.
Mhm.
I'm working from the fact that what I see is the fact that when we apply self-conscious control, we tend
Mhm.
to become, we tend to choke. We do this sort of
Mhm.
choking and micro choking thing. So
Mhm.
again, our movement quality goes down.
Mhm.
Um, I'm moving from the idea that we have evolved
Mhm.
to give control of our body
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
reflexive and involuntary and sort of automatic processes
Mhm.
that help us to regulate sort of simple and uninteresting problems, such as balance. It's not something that we have to think about. It's something that our cerebellum takes care of.
Mhm.
A lot of fine motor control. So I don't need to
Mhm.
think about how to reach the
Mhm.
webcam. I just have to
Mhm.
have the intention to reach the webcam, and my finger will
Mhm.
do that by offering, variation and self-correction and all of this sort of thing.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, that would be my response there. Is just like I'm not
Mhm.
reasoning just from it's natural, therefore it's good. Although I also
Mhm.
see that this is
Mhm.
more in line with the kind of control that animals use, that animals are very,
Mhm.
very present, that animals tend
Mhm.
towards a very low muscle tone. Healthy
Mhm.
animals have a very
Mhm.
low resting muscle tone, whereas a lot of humans have a very high resting muscle tone. And for me, this would be a way in which we are not present. And by that, I
Mhm.
mean a way in which we're not dealing with the primary process, like
Mhm.
sensory reality. Because if I'm
Mhm.
sort of armored like this,
Mhm.
the thing that's not getting through to me is
Mhm.
what's available in the present moment. Um,
Mhm.
is my ability to respond to visual, proprioceptive, auditory
Mhm.
information.
Mhm. So if I'm if I'm what I'm understanding so far is that you're looking at oh, no man there's some discrepancy that is uh between your current point of view and my point of view that I can sense it's there, and I think that's where your criticism comes up, and I believe that the criticism has an extremely high degree of value, but I can't piece apart yet why I'm stubborn about something. And I wanna how to put this. I think when you and I have good sessions, we're experiencing something very similar. We're experiencing there's a sort of it's more playfulness rather than solely based on structure. It is probably having a loosely defined goal. I want to get this lache to cat hang, or I want to do my whatever, like multi-step cartwheel in a certain shape and form. Um, And then what happens a lot of the time is we give our first solution, our first attempt at the thing. We show to ourselves that our theory wasn't quite correct because if we stick it right away, it's actually not an interesting riddle.
Mhm.
Or even if we stick it right away, then we might find that there's more subtlety in how we could land it more softly or land it with less jarring forces at the level of the head that we're perceiving or something like it. So there's almost always a deeper challenge or not a deeper challenge, but there's sort of a deeper problem, I would say, that we're trying to solve. We're not too tied to achieving it right now in the moment, but we want to see if we can progress towards that problem. And even when I'm using my language, it's sort of a very, it's very sort of on a very cognitive sort of left-brained language that I'm using. When I speak about sort of, I would say most of the joy that I'm getting is in the exchange with the task, and that is very similar to how I might enjoy trying to solve a mathematics problem. And I actually wouldn't put the two greatly apart. And like the joy that I'm getting from moving, or in how I'm producing joy in moving, whether that's strength, flexibility training, any coordination task, playing part in a team sports, I would say I would liken that joy to me solving a complex mathematical problem, which I can't really do, but you know, the little like the at the low level that I can do it, that's I would make a difference in these two experiences.
Mhm.
And I would even say that in solving the mathematical problem, it's a very embodied process.
Mhm.
It's a sensing of like there's friction. I'm stuck there. Maybe I have more tools if I'm thinking about it in this other direction. So I'm not saying it's a purely sort of rational, brain-centered thing that occurs, but it is still that problem-solving process. And now I'm thinking, if in mathematics, maybe I'm really good at trigonometry, and in general, I don't know, maybe shapes come easily to me, and thinking about it in terms of angles or arcs is just easier for me than to think of it in terms of equations. Now, what I'm curious about is I feel I've used one type of tool set in my acrobatic process. Let's just say that that's the sort of angles and curves process. It's the data measures. I can sense that you have a different tool set. And I'm trying to find out what's the easiest way that I can connect to the tool set that you're offering that is this sort of sensory driven, more bottom up kind of um, not top down, but rather it is quite an ecological approach, which is interesting because even though I am interested it's probably the difficulty that I'm always dealing with. Even though I'm interested in the ecological dynamics approach, to me, really at the heart of what I believe what being a person means and literally what reality is that it is an information process occurrence.
Mhm.
Like the reality that we're experiencing, I'm quite convinced that we can have in the future silicon-based experiences opposed to carbon-based experiences. And I think they differ in nature, but essentially that what it means to be a person is an information process that is independent from the medium in which it occurs.
Mhm.
So my difficulty is when ecological dynamics tries to um, possibly look at the world simply through uh, how to put it. There's not enough emphasis on the person in the ecological approach
Mhm.
because they're so equally balanced between the task and the environment that, or I wouldn't say with the ecological approach, I would say possibly the constraints-led approach of coaching and the research that's being done in that direction leans so heavily on what's almost a behaviorist way of looking at the world, which is I can influence behavior if I change the environment that it happens in. I can change the reflexes that occur based on the conditioning that apply to the person. And the performer themselves, like being, I don't know, they're being a they're a key piece that can influence themselves through their own rationale or through their own thought. And that's where I think you actually have a ton of knowledge. And I can't quite, you know, if we're playing with puzzle pieces,
Mhm.
then I feel like we're playing with slightly different pieces where the end shapes don't quite hook yet. But I'm trying to get it to click.
Mhm. So let's talk about flow, because I think this is where we're coming together.
Mhm, mhm,
So if you're solving a mathematics problem, what feels frustrating is when you feel like you should be able to do it, but there's a moment that you just can't quite get past, and you feel like the answer should be available, and you just feel like you're making no progress at all. So there's this sort of
mhm,
stagnation, this kind of frustration. The flow has stopped abruptly.
mm,
In a movement context, it's the same. There's a lâcher, there's a cartwheel, something that I feel like I ought to be able to solve. and somehow the flow just gets blocked. Like I'm almost at the point of getting it, and I'm just not quite there, and I can't figure out how to continue that flow of information. That I'm not gaining more information. In a social context, it's the same. So
Hmm.
I'm really enjoying a conversation. We're sort of we're learning, we're making progress, or we're just enjoying exchanging information, sort of subtly getting to know each other better. You know,
Mm.
this happens through conversation. There's also flow of conversation. It's also in a way it's about gaining information. It's like now I
Hmm.
know a little bit more about this person, not just sort of cognitively their story, but I also know a bit more about their internal state, which I'm inferring through their voice and face. And maybe I'm checking on these things like, oh, did you feel like
Mm.
this? And so
Mm.
I'm really getting a sort of broader understanding of this other person.
Mm.
If I then in a social context, I then say, then I make a joke and that joke just
Mm.
doesn't go down well, you know, suddenly the flow of conversation stops. It's like that feels very unpleasant. It's very not, it's
Hmm.
really not joyful, you know, when you make
Hmm.
a joke that goes really, really wrong in that way. I'm sure you've
It depends
experienced
on
that
the point of view, but yeah, can be
but
hilarious for a third person from the
for a third
outside.
person, yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yeah. 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 For someone with a bit more Schadenfreude. Um,
Yeah.
but generally for the participant, yeah, it's something
Mm.
that it sort of stops there. And
Mm.
maybe Schadenfreude, it's a little bit deviant because you are enjoying someone else's flow kind of getting broken, you know. So it's
Mhm.
like can be not so nice for that reason.
Definitely a bit deviant.
Yeah. So there's a great explanation of flow,
Hmm.
um, which is the something like, and maybe paraphrasing a little bit, but it's something like the alignment of different domains.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the example that's given in this piece is that when you have an archer,
Mm.
they're in a flow state. They're
Mm.
aiming at the target. You know, there's this
Mm.
like classic like Zen in the art of archery. The sort of like the self
Mm.
kind of dissolves in this moment of absolute focus, of
Mm.
absolute unity. If you look at the different domains that are aligned there, there's the proprioceptive domain. There's the sensation of the arms and the whole body. There's the visual,
Mm.
you know, visual information, visual domain. There's the intention, you know, to hit the target.
Mm.
And then, you know, perhaps several other kind of um, potentially unimodal, I use that word again, different kinds of
Mm.
sort of unitary, divided types of sensation that all seamlessly come together harmoniously.
Mm.
So we experience that as flow.
Hmm.
And it would be like,
Like a harmonious chord.
yeah, yeah. And it would be the same if you were solving a math problem and maybe you got frustrated and then the answer came and then the flow came back.
Hmm.
Or just, you know, you're just solving sort of like appropriately challenging math problems and you have this sort of
Mm.
flow of information. It's like
Mm.
my eyes, my
Mm.
prefrontal cortex, whatever, you know, these different
Mm.
domains are all working together
Mm.
um seamlessly. And then you get this sort of, you know, dissolution of the self and all this interesting stuff.
Mm.
Um so yeah, I mean I think that you can find some interesting stuff from that. Like if you if you look at the this um like harmonious flow as you know as joy as a sort of joyful or even blissful state in its extremes, then you might ask like what might be preventing that kind of harmonious flow. So what type of experience might not be able to sort of synchronize?
Can I interject?
Yeah.
Um, I know Huberman criticized the flow state as essentially a non-learning state
Hmm.
because he says that the um, essentially the error rate needs to be so low that we can be quite sure that learning isn't present. That's at least when the basketballer is saying he's getting every shot, and the jazz musician is saying he's in the pocket. That's when they're essentially not making mistakes. So the mistakes they're making, they're managing to correct midway.
Yeah.
Um, and that would So
Hmm.
that's where for me it aligns more to think of happiness as the state of continuously solving one's problem, where part of the state is the struggling to find a solution to then come up with it, with
Hmm.
having the different um, sort of uh, the different uh, colors of emotion being present, yet because they're under the same umbrella, I can experience the otherwise unpleasant thing as something pleasant because it's helping me in the long run. Like I might have the greatest mathematics problem solving session ever when I feel like I really conquered a tough problem and I bit my teeth over it for like an hour, and now I'm managing to solve it. And that's where I think my idea of optimizing for fulfilling practice is optimizing in one's problem solving capacity, which requires being okay with the, or not only being okay, but seeing the effort as a good piece of the practice. Just like I think Sam Harris keeps giving this example where um, uh, we can reinterpret the negative feelings of working out, but if we woke
Hmm.
up in the middle of the night with the same level of muscle soreness or negative sensation after doing a set of 20 heavy squats, then we would say like something is incredibly wrong. I need to go to the hospital. But in the context of actually doing the workout, we understand that the same kind of pain becomes something meaningful and even motivating and something
Hmm.
positive.
Hmm. Hmm. For sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really great point. Um, I think dispositional joy
Mhm,
or a tendency towards positive emotion, I think it makes us a lot more resilient to stress. I think it makes
mhm,
us see carry things lightly. You know that
mhm,
I think we're kind of focusing on this
mhm,
more sort of like um, that which flows grows and that which is stiff sort of withers and dies, like this kind of perspective. But there is another perspective which is
mhm,
more like Western, like Kierkegaard. He talks about um, the joy of limitation,
mhm,
and once you have a sort of clear sense of limitation, whether that's the goal, whether that's God, then it's a lot
mhm,
easier to sort of tolerate stress.
mhm,
So similar
mhm,
to the Jordan Peterson thing, but actually emphasizing
mhm,
joy. So Kierkegaard
mhm,
is like, you
mhm,
when you find your cross,
mhm,
even though your journey is heavy and long, you're
mhm,
still able to go it lightly.
mhm, mhm.
So I think for sure, yeah.
Mm.
The flow thing, I want to push back on the Huberman
Mhm.
comment a little bit. I think it's a little bit
Mhm.
simplistic because I
Mhm.
think when you're in a flow state and you
Mhm.
encounter a larger problem,
Mhm.
I think it's a lot easier to sort of meaningfully play with that error signal. And I'm maybe thinking a
Mhm.
bit more in a movement context.
Mhm.
Something that I've been developing is a sort of like circular approach to acrobatics. So it's like
Mhm.
using continuous circles.
Mhm.
And then you notice little errors or little positive errors, little opportunities of
Mhm.
like, oh, I actually dove into that a little bit more
Mhm.
and it felt good. And then
Mhm.
you have a lot of space to continue playing within those
Mhm.
little kind of information pockets, let's say.
Mhm. Mhm.
So in that sense, that kind of flow of information I find to be very conducive to learning because you can notice and
Mhm.
respond to errors very
Mhm.
immediately. Um,
Mhm.
Whereas if you just do one move and then you pause for
Mhm.
30 seconds, one move, pause for 30 seconds,
Mhm.
the lack of flow, it
Mhm.
can make it harder to build a sort of really clear, sensory map. So it's not a
Mhm.
perfect approach, but I think it lends
Mhm.
itself very well to learning
Mhm.
in the right kind of context
Mhm.
and flow. So, and there are all kinds of problems with flow for sure. And if you're always in this sort of like flow state, I think you can become very avoidant. And I think there are
Mhm.
also pathways to addiction that are present by overemphasizing flow and ease.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, for sure. The emphasis on, I think one of the best things that you can communicate to a student is stress is where learning is going to happen. And so if you can, gravitate towards stress, like that's a really meaningful thing to do, for sure.
That is an interesting point. Stress is where learning is going to happen, and how to not have that being opposed to joy in the practice.
Okay, okay. So here's something that I'll circle back to now.
Hmm.
So we spoke about relaxation, and then I wanted to speak about
Hmm.
um, I would call this non-judgment.
Hmm.
For me, that's the context that's been
Hmm.
very, very, very
Hmm.
meaningful.
Hmm.
Um, the ability
Oh, that's
to
so difficult, Flynn.
it's a practice. It's a
Mm.
practice, and it really is a practice because okay, so let's look at it in a couple of different ways. So
Hmm.
there's a practice of um, there are many different possible meditation objects, let's say. So, the
Mm.
breath is a classic one. There's also
Mm.
something called the energy body, which sounds very woo-woo, but it's just
Mm.
a way of paying attention to the sort of
Mm.
fuzzy, vibratory sensations of the body.
Mm.
So this is a space that you can work with, that you can pay attention to.
Mm.
It is a primary layer. So it's a
Mm.
sensory space, which means that if you're paying
Mm.
attention to it, you're not
Mm.
judging,
Mm.
technically.
Mhm.
Um, Another approach is working with equanimity. Is that a familiar
Mhm.
phrase?
No.
So equanimity, my definition of it would be that you're redistributing your sort of perceptual hierarchy. So
Mhm.
normally, if I'm in a conversation with someone, I might start to sort of fixate on them.
Mhm.
Um, and then in the worst case, I might start to fixate on a particular thought.
Mm.
And a small example of that would be in conversation. It's very common that you'll be talking to someone and they'll have a thought in their head and then they want to
Mm.
express it and then they actually stop listening to you or you stop listening to them.
Mhm. Mhm.
That would be one example of a sort of more rigid kind of perceptual hierarchy. Like there's some kind of goal that
Mm.
you have like to express this point,
Mm.
and that goal being rigid just stops the flow of experience.
Mm.
Equanimity is a way to flatten that hierarchy to sort of redistribute your sort of goals
Mhm.
and this sort of thing. So there are
Mhm.
physical practices that you can do. One of them is called mountain gazing. So the way
Mhm.
to sort of get into it is that you just take your hands here and
Mhm.
then you just take them wider, wider,
Mm.
wider, 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 see how far you
Mm.
can stay with them.
Mm.
And then after a while, you can develop that as
Mm.
a state that you can, tap into very quickly. And it's very, very helpful
Mm.
in terms of getting back into a sort of flow of experiences.
So it's interesting because I know the practice as well in a different context, um, but it's very hard for me to make the bridge between doing that and now thinking about what do I want to do in my next acro session.
Yeah. But
And that's where I'm current. Yeah,
mhm.
yeah. Please, please.
They're probably um so a couple of thoughts. One is like they're different systems, probably.
Hmm. Hmm.
So in one way, if I'm trying to decide on a goal, maybe I want to be in a more sort of narrow focus state. But on the other hand, if I'm in a more open and receptive state, I mean that there's a the inspiration is something that I also wanted to speak about is something
Hmm.
very, very
Hmm.
important
Hmm.
in terms of what I really appreciate about your perspective, your values here that we also really share. I think is
Hmm.
the like rejection of authoritarianism rather.
Hmm.
That was my battery. Yeah. The rejection of coercion, and so inspiration is a very, very potent way. So the word, of course, inspiration means to breathe in.
Hmm.
And if you think about it literally, what we do before we breathe in is we breathe out. So we empty.
Hmm. 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 Hmm.
And so inspiration is something that might also be easier to find in this more sort of equanimous state,
Hmm. Hmm.
rather than this sort of very like narrow and goal directed state, which tends to make us a little bit less receptive. So it's not
Hmm.
to say one is good, one is bad,
Hmm.
but there's a lot of utility in finding these sort of like
Hmm.
semi hypnagogic states in terms of just thinking
Hmm.
sort of more deeply about things. something that I try and recommend to a conversation that I always have with students is who inspires
Mm,
you, what inspires you.
mm,
And it's a very, very interesting, kettle of fish to sort of to dive into in terms of what that particular inspiration actually might mean for the person, for
mm,
example. And now we're in some interesting territory, but
mm,
every single person that I've had this conversation with, which is probably around 15 people,
mm,
all of the people who are a little bit more intellectual, who are a little bit more
mm,
stiff, they all
mm,
say, I'm very inspired by people who can do beautiful flow and beautiful macacos and things like this. They all
mm,
say that.
mm,
It's like, well, why would that be the case?
mm,
Why would that be?
mm,
The people with a
mm,
particular sort of somatic disposition
mm,
or
mm,
sort of more like a cognitive personality type, they all want this sort of arching position and they all want this flow. And so again, talking about these sort of
mm.
this sort of harmonious flow of different kinds of streams of information, the thing that I think stops a lot of people's flow is intellectual thought, and it is analysis.
Wow, it's so interesting. Um,
More like during the experience,
Analysis.
maybe, but
Mhm.
please go on.
Ah, okay, I can relate a little bit more. Like when the practitioner says, I was getting in my own head. I was just thinking it didn't work anymore. That's interesting because I would always try to solve these problems sort of at the layer where they're created. Um, sort of thinking, if this is a problem right now, and I find myself thinking, can't I use that drive, that energy that's being focused right now on overthinking something and redirect it rather than sort of stop the process in its entirety? Some things that I'm writing down sort of to as takeaways is that a big part is a playful attitude, which requires sort of loosening the perspective or the grip of a goal, loosening the frame or widening the frame, because that allows for more positive surprises. If I have a very narrow stream in which can positively surprise myself by hitting the bullseye, then I'll be essentially upset every other time.
Mhm.
But if I could then say, let's see, how would it work in a dart throwing perspective? I could, of course, play with constraints and say,
Mhm.
well, where can I throw when I just cover one eye?
Yeah,
Because my expectation will be a lot lower because I've
yeah.
never done it before. Then another part is I want to gain more information. Essentially, I'll feel arrested when I feel like I'm not getting any more new insights. It's like I was thinking about the math problems for half an hour, and for the past 20 minutes, there's been no novel insight. I've just kept repeating the same few things. So, in some way, um, gaining more information is useful, and I can change my practice to, for example, allow for more repetitions or do something circular. And essentially, I want to increase the amount of variability in some way or another. And these two pair together well. A third piece that is sort of the thing that I can do before the practice is tap into my interests and say, what am I inspired by? So rather than saying I have a goal that I set for myself 2 weeks ago, but it's not motivating me any
Mhm.
longer, I can
Mhm.
say, let me not even start the practice that I don't have a connection to right now. How can I create a connection to my future practice by placing sort of a goal in front of me so that between me and the practice, I have this anchor that I already feel compelled by, or the magnet that's pulling me in the direction of the practice. I'd say these are sort of the three, and then the part that I don't know where to put or how to tie it to a tool yet is I want to move away from stiffness. It's sort of the moving away from rigidity in thought, but also in my body, quite literally.
Mm. Something really interesting that came from the anxiety study was
Hmm.
two different ways in which motor control breaks down related to
Hmm.
anxiety.
Hmm.
Which the simpler version would be someone who is overly stiff, which we've spoken a bit about,
Hmm.
and someone who is overly loose, so
Hmm.
uncoordinated. And so
Hmm.
these two
Hmm.
different motor control types might benefit from different kinds of strategies.
Or is that are there studies that literally say we have a stiff learner and we have a looser
Yeah, yeah,
learner?
yeah.
And
It's
they're
in
both originate in anxiety, like in negative? Do you
The
think that?
context is it's in the context of like Bayesian brain predictive processing stuff,
Mm-hmm.
which I like.
Mm-hmm.
And it says that people with rigid priors, so
Mm-hmm.
who enter into a situation with a specific set of cognitive or muscular beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
will tend towards rigidity, which means that they'll have a sort of fixed set of solutions that are not very flexible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think Callum Powell is quite a good example of this. Like he's quite
Mm-hmm.
physically stiff and he's very, very good at a very select kind of context. But if you put him in a sort of unpredictable, um, like a slide or a swing or something, it's like it's not really
Mm-hmm.
something that he's willing to do. Um, and then on the other hand, you have someone who enters into a situation and they don't have a strong set of beliefs, but they don't have a they're sort of unconstrained.
Mm-hmm.
And so this would be the kind of anxiety that is they're not looking down, but they're sort of
Mm-hmm.
looking all around. They're sort of constantly searching for information.
Yeah, I definitely connect to that second one more.
Mm.
In my movements, of course, as well. Like I
Mm-hmm.
see my limbs flare all over the place when
Uh-huh.
I feel lost. It's not that I tighten up and
Oh,
just
that's
pull
really
through.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I'm the other. I tend towards more like when I lose myself, I tighten up. Yeah.
Mm,
And
mm,
that's something I'm working with, and that's really interesting. Yeah.
mm. That is super interesting. So, but are there sort of either physiological or kinematic markers that have been tested? Like, can I detect these two group of people easily objectively? Because of course, it's one way to think of it. Myself of one
Yeah.
type.
So I think you can build stereotypes that
Hmm.
are like somewhat valid quite easily, quite intuitively,
Hmm.
um, in terms of how you communicate with someone. I think there are little kind of
Hmm.
cues and clues there. For example, if someone is you notice that they always say the same kinds of things, they always express the same kinds of beliefs about themselves or the world. It's like even without seeing their body, maybe you could infer that this is a more rigid person.
Hmm. Hmm.
And likewise, if you see someone's body language, and you might easily infer that they're in the more sort of loose
Mm.
group. But I think
I
you
feel
could
like
also
I'm sorry.
see. Mhm,
I
go
also
on.
interrupted you along the way because you were on the path of speaking about, I believe, how the overly loose person will have a different approach to solving a movement problem compared to the overly stiff.
Yeah,
Can I ask you to elaborate on that?
yeah, yeah. No, it's a really interesting perspective for sure. So if you're very loose, if you're fundamentally uncoordinated, if the
Hmm.
different parts of your body are not able to work, synergistically,
Hmm.
then probably the priority for you would be to establish basic like contralateral control, ipsilateral
Hmm.
control, different kinds of rolling motions of the spine,
Mm.
different ways of connecting these sort of like tensegrity structures of the core. And this is my
Mm.
perspective. This
Mm.
this would be very, very, very helpful for creating these whole body connections.
Mm.
But
Mm.
then if you're very, very stiff, um, we're talking, I guess, more sort of right now in a sort of like almost like
Hmm.
rehabilitative context. But
Hmm.
with the more stiff person, you might work with dissociation, differentiation.
Hmm.
So can I swing my arms and legs all to the left side? Then can I swing my
Mm.
arms to the left and legs to the right?
Mm.
Um, can I articulate the top of my neck without
Mm.
moving the bottom?
Hmm.
Can I make a,
Interesting.
a circle with my head?
Hmm.
Um, can I look straight forwards and
Mm.
twist to the
Ooh.
side? This sort of
Hmm.
thing. So these would be
Hmm.
kind of vestibular reflexes, things like this.
Hmm.
um, which I would expect, maybe both groups, but I would expect the stiffer group, if they don't have that kind of
Hmm.
responsivity in the top of the neck,
Mm.
would maybe struggle
Mm.
with things like gaze
Mm.
stabilization also.
Hmm. Hmm.
But maybe that's a little
Interesting.
of a tangent. But and then in terms of like more like pedagogically, if it's a looser person, you might want to give them more specific constraint.
Mm.
You might want to work with more specified kind of
Mm.
goal directed stuff, like of course allowing degrees of freedom, but
Mm.
recognizing that they're going to,
Mhm.
every time they do something, it's going to look different. So maybe you
Mhm.
want to constrain them a little bit more and then, build out from
Mhm.
there. Whereas the stiffer person,
Mm.
maybe they're so constrained that you want to play more games. Maybe you want to take a
Mm.
more open approach for them and try
Mm.
and get them in a more reactive and
Mm.
spontaneous kind of orientation.
Mm. In the context of a self practice and motivation, I can imagine that for me, I'm not quite sure where I fit in now, but
Mm.
um, if I am more of the loose person, then applying quite specific constraints and saying I'm sort of I'm requesting of myself to find. I could imagine something like practicing reactivity because reactivity requires stiffness, but there's still a lot of games that I can create around that. Whether that's I am very luxurious and I have a force measurement plate and I can test every rep, like how quick do I get off the piece, or I can do some plyometric variations and see like how quickly can I get off the floor, and I use something like rhythm or timing to get a sense for it. I still might find that for me as a person, I actually don't want to do the stiffness stuff. I feel super good in doing my loose flopping around thing.
Yeah.
And then I'm dropping off the edge a little bit where I want to ride my sort of motivational high line. Then what do I do? What's the error correction mechanism I
Mhm.
can apply for myself?
Yeah, maybe the Snoop Dogg principle.
Tell me more.
If it feels good, it's good for you.
Ah, good.
No, but yeah, for sure. Like individual style, it really
Mhm,
is a real thing. I think again, just sort of as a coach or as a person, maybe a coach externally as an authority figure can say like, well, you have this desire for this kind of style, that's great, but you're also super
mm,
weak and floppy, and realistically, you need to get a bit stronger.
mhm,
I think again, like going back to this notion of inspiration, I think is something that
mm,
could really connect to a sort of ecological dynamics approach.
mhm,
If
mhm.
ecological dynamics people were not so stiff and like
Interesting, eh?
secular, which is like my repulsion a little
Uh,
bit. I just
mm,
I see. I think I struggle to take uh, ecological dynamics seriously a little bit because I
mhm,
see that the Overton window is very small
mhm,
within that approach. It's like
mhm,
I'll take seriously any
mhm,
like scientific paper,
mm,
but I'm not going to take seriously the work of like Carl Jung or like James Hillman or like
mm,
Feldenkrais or
mhm,
Wilhelm Reich or like any of these kind of weird,
mm,
interesting people. It's like, no, that's
mhm,
like outside of this kind of like safe territory.
mhm, mhm. Interesting. So you would say the ecological dynamics folks tend to be on the rigid end, leaning heavily towards what their research says, but not connecting the dots across fields quite as well.
I would say, yeah, I don't see, I'm a dot connector and I don't see a lot of dot connecting happening in ecological dynamics,
Hmm.
apart from like Rafe Kelly, for example. He's a
Hmm.
dot
Hmm.
connector for sure.
Mm.
And I guess John Vervaeke, I don't know if he counts as an ecological.
Ecological dynamics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a little different, isn't it?
Uh, Whenever we find we're too constrained, here's the thing. I like critical experiments that rule out uh, wrong theories, just like we have the what is it called? Was it Eddington? No, the exploration when Newton's theory of gravity was completely refuted because it didn't align with the experiment of where the light of the star should appear if space-time didn't curve the
Mhm.
light that would reach us. And because light cannot be affected by gravity, it cannot be that the force of gravity is a real thing. We have to find another explanation. Therefore, Einstein says, yay, my theory kind of works. So critical experiment, I think, is really relevant in differentiating between two kinds of explanation. But what seems to be true about all the explanation that so far include a person or a mind that's involved, they're quite fuzzy. They're not definite. They're not
Mhm.
easy to roll out. And I think there's a sort of false dichotomy in the ecological dynamics versus information processing crowd, where um, we pretend as though we have crisp and clear explanation of how movement learning works. And what I think is a little bit more appropriate is saying, if before we didn't take the environment, task, and performer into account as something that creates emergent movement solutions, then we're missing a piece. But it should be something like, great, we're missing a piece. The environment obviously plays a role. The person who is doing the movement plays a role. And the task in relation to these two things, those all contribute to a movement solution being created.
Mhm.
Therefore, if I have something as simplistic as saying I have a robotic view of how movement is created and individual motor programs that will dictate exact levels of muscle tension, then I can say that's relatively easy to refute. Good. Strawman put aside, probably someone in the 1800s thought that that was the exact way that it was, and it isn't.
Yeah.
But now the question sort of, I would love to have more clarity in sports science when it comes to I just would love to have more clarity, but I think that is a tricky aspect as long as creativity isn't understood, consciousness isn't understood, freedom of choice isn't understood at the level of which we can perceive it.
I think what's important for me is recognizing that when when you're seeking clarity, you can really dry things up.
Mhm,
So,
mhm,
clarity means to see things clearly. It also means to refine, to clarify.
mhm, mhm,
And I think you can make things very dry. And as
mhm,
you're saying, human movement, human existence is very fuzzy. It's very
mhm,
moist. It's very earthy in reality.
mhm,
And I think we can really take the blood out of these things by kind of overanalyzing. I
mhm,
really I'm reading Rob Gray's book now, the new one, and there's some really nice stuff there in terms of like um looking at the criteria for like aliveness
mhm,
within design. Like this kind of thing is really cool. And
mhm,
and and this is like almost the kind of irony that I see with the ecological dynamics approach, or maybe just the people that I've encountered who are into it, is like they're very,
mhm,
very rigid about like terminology and
mhm,
attributing authorship to who's done the study
mhm,
and all of these things. Um, but they're ultimately coming from a really I think very grounded place, which is like we
mhm,
want autonomy, um, we want people to feel good, we
mhm,
want people to be excited and have control over what they're doing, and we want
mhm,
people to be free and liberated, and so there's a really like
mhm,
beautiful philosophy,
mhm,
um, but it's just presented in this like very very dry dry language. And
mhm. I'm interested in helping people learn acrobatics with more ease when they say they have an interest in acrobatics.
yeah,
At which point is my perspective as valuable as some of the tools or the research that is pointing towards why the tools exist? At what point is that as valuable?
well, what can AI never do?
Mhm,
In my opinion, it can't inspire.
mhm. Ooh. Mhm, mhm. Interesting.
Need I say more?
That was a perfectly concise and at the same time a very deep statement.